In the winter of 1945, at a prisoner of war camp in rural Louisiana, a German woman stood frozen at a doorway, paralyzed by two words she couldn't comprehend. An American guard had just stepped aside, gestured politely, and said with a slight smile, "Ladies first." The woman Helga Schneider, a 24-year-old, former Wehrmacht auxiliary, stared at him in complete confusion. Behind her, a dozen other German women prisoners waited, equally bewildered. Was this a trick? A test? Some kind of trap designed to humiliate them? After all, they were prisoners of war, enemies of the United States, defeated soldiers of the Third Reich. Why would their captor treat them with courtesy? The American guard, Corporal James Wilson from Tennessee, noticed their hesitation and confusion. He gestured again, more emphatically this time, repeating, "Go ahead, ladies. After you." Still, the German women didn't move. Finally, the eldest among them, a 35-year-old nurse named Marguerite Klein, stepped cautiously through the doorway, half expecting punishment for her presumption. When nothing happened, when the guards simply nodded and smiled, the other women slowly followed, whispering to each other in rapid German, trying to understand what had just occurred. This scene, repeated thousands of times across prisoner of war camps in the United States during 1944 and 1945, represents one of the most fascinating cultural collisions of World War II. German women who had been captured serving in military and auxiliary roles found themselves imprisoned in a country whose social customs were radically different from everything they had known. The simple phrase, "ladies first," an everyday courtesy in mid-20th century. American culture became a source of profound confusion, suspicion, and eventually transformation for women who had been trained in a totalitarian system that valued obedience, hierarchy, and collective duty over individual dignity and gendered courtesy. To understand why these two words could be so disorienting, we must first understand who these German women prisoners were, how they came to be in American captivity, and what their experiences had been in Nazi Germany and during the war. We must also understand American culture in the 1940s, a society that, despite its own significant gender inequalities, maintained social customs around feminine deference that were fundamentally incompatible with Nazi ideology. The collision between these worldviews, playing out in the mundane interactions of prison camp life, would reveal profound truths about culture, power, gender, and what it means to treat people with basic human dignity. The German women held as prisoners of war in the United States represented a small but significant population, somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 women, though exact numbers remain disputed due to incomplete records. They included Luftwaffe auxiliaries, who had operated anti-aircraft guns, and certain Wehrmacht signals operators who had worked in communications, nurses who had served in military hospitals, and even a handful of SS auxiliaries who had worked in administrative capacities. Most had been captured in North Africa, Italy, or France. As German forces retreated, they were transported across the Atlantic to the United States, where they joined the much larger population of male German POWs held in camps scattered across the American South, Midwest, and West. American authorities were unprepared for female prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions specified treatment standards for POWs, but these had been written with male combatants in mind. How should women prisoners be housed, guarded, and treated? Should they be subject to the same work requirements as male POWs? What security measures were appropriate? And perhaps most challenging, how could American guards maintain proper military discipline while also adhering to deeply ingrained American cultural norms about how men should treat women, norms that emphasized courtesy, protection, and deference? The result was a peculiar hybrid. Women were prisoners subject to military discipline and confinement, yet they were also ladies in the context of 1940s. American culture entitled to courtesies like having doors held open, being allowed to go first in lines, and being addressed with particular forms of politeness. This contradiction created constant cognitive dissonance for both the German women and their American guards. The phrase, "ladies first," emerging from this tension, became a focal point where vastly different worldviews collided and where both groups were forced to confront their assumptions about gender, power, and human dignity. To understand the confusion of German women, POWs, when confronted with American courtesies, We must first understand how gender roles were constructed in Nazi Germany, and what these women's experiences had been before captivity. The Nazi regime promoted a very specific ideal of German womanhood that was fundamentally different from the feminine ideals that prevailed in the United States and Britain during the same period. Nazi ideology emphasized women's primary role as mothers and homemakers, the biological reproducers of the Aryan race. The regime's famous slogan about women's proper sphere was Kinder, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Women were encouraged to have large families, to devote themselves to domestic duties, and to support their men's roles in building the Thousand-Year Reich. This ideology discouraged women's higher education, professional careers, and participation in public life. Beyond carefully controlled organizations like the NS-Freundschaft National Socialist Women's League. However, Nazi practice diverged significantly from Nazi theory, especially as the war intensified and Germany faced severe labor shortages. By 1943, with millions of German men serving in the military, the regime had no choice but to mobilize women into war production and even auxiliary military roles. Women worked in munitions factories, operated anti-aircraft batteries, served as communications specialists, and filled countless support roles that freed men for combat duty. By 1945, approximately 500,000 German women were serving in military auxiliary positions. This created a profound contradiction that German women themselves experienced acutely. They were simultaneously told that their proper role was maternal domesticity, and that their patriotic duty required them to work in factories and serve in military support roles. They were praised for their feminine softness and nurturing nature while being trained to operate weapons, systems, and work under harsh military discipline. They were idealized as pure German maidens while being subjected to the brutal realities of total war. The women who ended up as American prisoners of war came predominantly from these auxiliary military services. Many had volunteered in the early war years, motivated by patriotism, economic necessity, or simply the desire for adventure and escape from restrictive provincial life. Others had been conscripted in the later war years as Germany's situation became desperate. Their experiences during service varied enormously. Some worked in relatively safe communication centers in Germany, while others served in active combat zones, operating anti-aircraft guns against Allied bombers or working in field hospitals under fire. What nearly all of them shared was extensive indoctrination in Nazi ideology and military discipline. From the Hitler Youth programs many had participated in as girls, through their training in auxiliary services, these women had been taught to value obedience, hierarchy, collective duty, and They had been told that individual comfort and personal dignity were irrelevant compared to the needs of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial community. They had learned to suppress personal desires, to accept harsh treatment without complaint, and to view authority relationships in purely hierarchical terms. Superiors commanded, inferiors obeyed. Crucially, Nazi military culture made no accommodation for gender-based courtesies or deference. A female auxiliary serving in a Wehrmacht unit was subject to the same harsh discipline as male soldiers. She received orders and followed them, regardless of how difficult or degrading the tasks might be. The idea that someone in authority would defer to her because of her gender, would show her special courtesy, or would prioritize her comfort over military efficiency would have been completely foreign, even contemptible, suggesting weakness and special pleading. Moreover, many of these women had internalized the regime's rhetoric about British and American decadence. They had been taught that Western democracies were weak, corrupted by materialism and individualism, led by Jewish influences that had undermined natural racial hierarchies. The idea of men showing deference to women might be interpreted through this ideological lens as evidence of Western weakness and confused gender relations, exactly the kind of decadence that strong, disciplined Germany was fighting against. When these women were captured in the chaotic retreats from North Africa during the collapse of Italy, in the desperate final months in France and Germany, they carried these internalized values with them into captivity. Most expected harsh treatment. Many feared execution, rape, or severe abuse, based partly on propaganda they had been exposed to and partly on realistic assessment of what German forces had done to prisoners in occupied territories. They approached captivity with the psychological defenses appropriate to anticipated brutality. Emotional numbness, resignation, Preparation for the worst. To understand why American guards said ladies first to German women prisoners, we must examine the gender culture of 1940s America culture that seems almost incomprehensible from our contemporary perspective, characterized by profound contradictions between restrictive gender roles and elaborate codes of masculine chivalry. Toward women. The United States in the 1940s was a society that rigidly separated men's and women's spheres, while simultaneously maintaining elaborate social customs around masculine deference to feminine delicacy. Women were largely excluded from positions of authority in business, politics, and the military. The vast majority of professions were effectively closed to them. Married women in many states couldn't own property in their own names, obtain credit without husband's permission, or serve on juries. Yet within this system of profound gender inequality, men were expected to perform visible ritualized acts of courtesy toward women, opening doors standing when women entered rooms, offering seats carrying heavy objects, and allowing women to go first in various social situations. This system of chivalric courtesy was not distributed equally across American society. It was most elaborately developed among the middle and upper classes, particularly in the South, where codes of honor and elaborate gender performance had deep historical roots. Working-class men might be less consistent in these performances, and African-American men were actually punished for showing such deference to white women. Any suggestion of social equality with white women could result in violence. But the ideal of masculine courtesy toward feminine delicacy was widely promoted in popular culture, taught to children, and generally understood as marking the difference between civilized behavior and barbarism. The men serving as guards in POW camps came predominantly from working and middle-class backgrounds, drawn from across the country, but with significant representation from southern states where camps were often located. They had been raised with these cultural codes, taught from childhood that ladies deserved special treatment not because of individual merit or achievement, but simply because of their gender and the supposed delicacy and moral purity it represented. These men genuinely believed that treating women with courtesy was a mark of civilization, of American decency, of the superiority of democratic values over fascist brutality. When confronted with female prisoners of war, American guards and camp administrators faced a genuine dilemma. Official regulations treated posts as a specific category with defined rights and restrictions under the Geneva Conventions. But these men's cultural programming told them that women deserved treatment different from men. The military command structure offered limited guidance on how to navigate this contradiction, leaving individual guards and camp commanders to improvise solutions based on their own cultural instincts. The result was a peculiar hybrid system. German women posts were subject to confinement, guard supervision, and work requirements like their male counterparts. But these requirements were implemented through a filter of American gender assumptions. Women were assigned appropriate work: cooking, laundry, sewing, light agricultural work rather than the heavy construction and industrial labor male posts performed. They were housed in separate facilities with female matrons, providing supervision for daily living activities. And in countless small daily interactions, American male guards performed the courtesy rituals they had been raised to believe were proper treatment of women. This included opening doors, stepping aside to let women pass first, offering to carry heavy objects, using polite forms of address, and generally performing the elaborate dance of masculine deference to feminine delicacy that characterized mid-century American gender relations. Male guards genuinely didn't see any contradiction between holding women as prisoners and holding doors open for them, between enforcing military discipline and saying "after you, ma'am." In their cultural framework, these behaviors operated on different registers. One was necessarily military duty. The other was simple human decency and proper masculine behavior. It's important to note the class and racial dimensions of this American chivalry. The white working and middle-class men serving as guards extended these courtesies to German women, post-white European women, who despite being enemies fit into existing American racial and class categories in ways that made them legible as ladies, deserving of courtesy. The same guards might not extend similar courtesy to women of color or to women they perceived as lower class or immoral. American chivalry was always selective, dependent on women performing appropriate femininity and occupying appropriate social categories. Nevertheless, from the perspective of German women prisoners encountering this system, The consistency of American male courtesy was striking and genuinely confusing. These weren't isolated incidents, but a systematic pattern. Nearly every American male guard they encountered performed these courtesies, apparently sincerely and without expecting anything in return. The women had to grapple with a fundamental question: was tease real? Or was it some kind of elaborate psychological manipulation designed to confuse and control them? The initial encounters between German women POWs and American courtesy customs occurred during the transport and intake process, creating immediate culture shock that would shape these women's entire experience of captivity. Most German women captured in North Africa, Italy, or France experienced several weeks of transit before arriving at permanent camps in the United States, first two holding facilities in the theater of operations, then by ship across the Atlantic, and finally by train, 2 camps in the American interior. During these transports, the women were understandably frightened and uncertain about their fate. Many had heard or participated in spreading propaganda about Allied brutality. They expected harsh treatment, possibly sexual violence, certainly the same kind of brutal efficiency that characterized German military operations. What they encountered instead was something that didn't fit any of their expectations or frameworks. American soldiers who were strict about security and discipline, but who also performed these strange rituals of courtesy that seemed completely inappropriate for the situation. Martha Hoffmann, 22-year-old Luftwaffe auxiliary who had operated searchlights in Italy before capture, later described her confusion in a 1980s oral history interview. When they captured us, I expected violence. Instead, the American soldiers were ... polite. Too polite. It was unsettling. They would hold doors open, step aside to let us pass, offer to carry our bags. We were prisoners. I kept waiting for the cruelty to begin, for them to reveal what they really intended. It took weeks before I began to believe this might actually be how they treated everyone. The confusion was compounded by language barriers. Most German women POWs had limited or no English. The phrase, "ladies first," might be literally translated, but its cultural meaning, the entire web of associations, assumptions, and social choreography it invoked was completely lost. Some women thought it was a command that they were being ordered to go first so guards could watch them more closely or to place them in greater danger. Others thought it was mockery that Americans were sarcastically calling them ladies to humiliate them. Very few initially understood it as a genuine courtesy. Upon arrival at permanent camps in the United States, usually located in rural areas of states like Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, the culture shock intensified. The camps themselves were austere but not brutal barrack-style housing, adequate food, medical care, recreational facilities. This was partly mandated by Geneva Convention requirements, partly reflecting American resources and administrative capacity, and partly expressing American intentions to demonstrate the superiority of democratic treatment of prisoners compared to how the Axis powers treated Allied POWs. The intake process typically involved medical examinations, documentation, assignment of POW numbers, and orientation to camp rules. During these processes, German women repeatedly encountered American courtesy customs that baffled them. Male guards and administrators would stand when women entered rooms, hold chairs for them, use titles like Miss or Mam, and perform elaborate door-holding rituals. Female staff members, administrators, matrons also participated in a feminine courtesy culture, though with different gendered dimensions. Greta Meyer, who had served as a signals operator and was captured in France in 1944, later recalled, "At the intake process, an American officer stood up when I entered his office. Stood up. For a prisoner. I thought I had misunderstood what was happening. Later, when I saw him do the same thing for every woman, I began to realize this was somehow normal for them, but it made no sense. We were enemies. We were prisoners. Why would he show respect?" The confusion was deepened by the fact that these courtesies coexisted with firm military discipline. American guards who politely held doors also enforced rules strictly, conducted regular inspections, and maintained clear authority hierarchy. The combination of courteous treatment and military discipline was cognitively dissonant for women, who had been trained to expect that authority figures would be harsh. That discipline required brutality. and that showing courtesy to subordinates was weakness. Some German women initially responded with suspicion and resistance. They refused to go first through doors, fearing traps. They ignored polite requests, expecting to be commanded more harshly. They looked for hidden cruelty behind the courtesy, assuming it must be a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. The inability to find the cruelty they expected was itself unsettling. It violated their understanding of how power relationships worked, how enemies treated each other, how military organizations functioned. As German women POWs settled into camp life during 1944 and 1945, they faced the challenge of adapting to an American courtesy culture that continued to bewilder them, while also navigating the very real constraints and deprivations of imprisonment. The daily routines of camp life provided countless opportunities for cultural collision around the phrase, "ladies first," and the gender assumptions it embodied. Mealtimes became a daily theater of cultural negotiation. In German military culture, soldiers formed orderly lines and received food in strict order of rank, or simply first come. In American POW camps, male guards would often gesture for women to go to the front of food lines, saying "ladies first." This created immediate problems. Should the women accept this privilege? Did accepting it mean acknowledging subordination or accepting American cultural dominance? Would it create resentment among male German posts in nearby compounds, who received no such deference? Initially, many women refused to go first, staying in their original position in line. But American guards would persist, sometimes making it clear that this was an optional, that allowing women to go first was how things were done, and everyone needed to accept it. This forced the women into a strange position, being compelled to accept a privilege they had unasked for and didn't understand, commanded to receive courtesy rather than being allowed to earn it or decline it. Elsa Weber, a nurse who had been captured in North Africa and spent nearly 2 years in a camp in Texas, later described the psychological complexity. At first, being told "ladies first" felt like an insult, like they were mocking us or treating us as weak. But over time I began to realize the Americans genuinely saw this as respectful behavior. They weren't trying to humiliate, else they literally couldn't conceive of treating women any other way. This was shocking because it revealed how different our societies were at a fundamental level. The work assignments for women POWs created another arena for cultural collision. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could be required to work, though not on tasks directly supporting the war effort. Male German POWs performed agricultural labor, helped with construction projects, and worked in various capacities that benefited from their labor while keeping them productively occupied. Female POWs were assigned work considered appropriate for women in 1940s America. Cooking for the camp population, doing laundry, sewing and repairing clothing, light gardening, and similar domestic tasks. This gendered division of labor was taken for granted by American administrators, but was noticeable to German women who had operated anti-aircraft guns, worked in communications, and performed various technical and military roles during their service. Some women found the domestic work demeaning a step backward from the more skilled and interesting work they had done during the war. Others found it less physically demanding than their previous duties, and were simply grateful for relatively easy work. American guards, supervising female work details, would continue performing courtesy rituals, opening doors, carrying heavy objects, stepping aside to let women pass. These small gestures accumulated over weeks and months, gradually wearing down the women's initial suspicion and creating a grudging recognition that this was simply how Americans behaved, not some elaborate strategy of manipulation. The presence of German male POWs in nearby compounds created additional complexity. In some larger camp facilities, men and women were housed separately but might encounter each other in certain work details, religious services, or other controlled settings. The differential treatment. American guards showing courtesy to German women while maintaining more purely disciplinary relationships with German men created tension and resentment among some male prisoners, who saw this as evidence of female privilege or American weakness. Some German men tried to reassert traditional German military hierarchy, expecting the women to defer to male authority even in the POW setting. But American camp administrators wouldn't allow this. Women prisoners were under American authority, not the authority of senior German male POWs. This created strange inversions, where German women, who would have been subordinate to male military personnel in Wehrmacht structures, now occupied parallel but separate status under American administration. Over time, Many German women posts began to cautiously experiment with the possibilities opened by American courtesy culture. If Americans believed women should go first, should be addressed politely, should have doors held open, perhaps, they could use these assumptions to negotiate slightly better conditions to make small requests that might be granted to establish marginally more dignified relationships with their captors. This was a delicate dance accepting American gender norms without fully endorsing them, using available cultural tools for survival without necessarily internalizing the ideology behind them. As months passed and German women posts accumulated experiences of American courtesy culture, something deeper than simple adaptation began to occur for many of them. The repeated experience of being treated with basic human dignity even within the constraints of to challenge the internalized assumptions they had developed through years of Nazi indoctrination and military service. The phrase, "ladies first," initially so confusing and suspicious, gradually became familiar. Women learned to recognize when an American guard was gesturing for them to go first, to accept the courtesy with a nod or quiet "thank you" to navigate doorways and corridors with the understanding that American men would step aside. This behavioral adaptation was relatively straightforward, but beneath the surface behaviors, some women began experiencing profound psychological shifts. For women who had spent years in systems that treated them as interchangeable units where their individual needs, preferences, and dignity were systematically suppressed in favor of collective discipline, consistent experience of being treated as individuals worthy of courtesy was transformative. It suggested that perhaps military efficiency and human dignity weren't mutually exclusive, that perhaps authority didn't require brutality, that perhaps they themselves were worth more than they had been taught to believe. Ingrid Bauer, who had served in military communications and spent 14 months as a POW in Louisiana, later reflected on this transformation in a 1991 memoir. "I began to realize that the American guards were unweak or decadent for treating us courteously. They were confident enough in their authority that they didn't need to brutalize us to maintain it." This was a revelation. In Germany, I had been taught that discipline required harshness, that showing kindness was weakness. But these Americans showed me a different possibility, that you could be firm and kind simultaneously. The transformation wasn't universal or uniform. Some women maintained rigid loyalty to Nazi ideology throughout their captivity and even after repatriation, interpreting American courtesy as evidence of weakness or decadence. Others underwent partial shifts, accepting some American values while rejecting others. Still others experienced profound ideological transformations, beginning to question everything they had been taught about gender, authority, and human dignity. Several factors influenced how individual women responded to this cultural encounter. Age-Mata Junge women who had less invested in Nazi ideology were often more adaptable. Education played a role. Women with broader educational backgrounds had more frameworks for making sense of cultural differences. Personal temperament was crucial. Some individuals were simply more psychologically flexible than others. The women also began comparing their treatment in American captivity with what they knew about German treatment of prisoners. Many had witnessed how German forces treated Soviet posts, Allied pilots who had been shot down, or civilians in occupied territories. The contrast was stark and disturbing. Some women began to confront uncomfortable questions about the regime they had served. If Americans could treat their enemies with basic dignity, why had Germans treated their enemies with such brutality? What did this say about the moral character of the two systems? These questions were dangerous and painful. Confronting them meant acknowledging complicity, meant recognizing that perhaps Germany had not been the victim defending itself against barbaric enemies, but rather the aggressor committing atrocities. Many women couldn't or wouldn't go there. Psychologically, the implications were too deep, but some did begin this difficult process of moral reckoning. And the everyday courtesies of American guards served as small but persistent evidence that perhaps everything they had been taught was wrong. The women also observed how American guards treated each other and how American society seemed to function based on what they could observe in the camp and in interactions with American civilian staff. They noticed that American soldiers, while maintaining military hierarchy, also seemed to have more casual, egalitarian relationships with superiors than German military culture. They observed that American women who worked in the camps, administrators, teachers who might visit to provide educational programs, seemed to have more authority and autonomy than women in equivalent positions would have had in Germany. Some camps provided educational programs and allowed German posts to take classes, learn English, and study various subjects. Women who participated in these programs encountered American ideas about democracy, individualism, and human rights that contrasted sharply with Nazi ideology. The combination of intellectual exposure to new ideas and daily lived experience of different social norms created conditions for genuine ideological transformation for some prisoners. Religious practice also played a role. Many camps provided access to chaplains and religious services for women from Catholic or Protestant backgrounds who had been forced to navigate the Nazi regime's hostile relationship with institutional Christianity. The opportunity to practice their faith freely was significant. Christian frameworks about human dignity, the equal worth of all souls, and the moral obligation to treat others with respect provided alternative ideological foundations to Nazi regime, hierarchy, and militarism. To fully understand the cultural collision around ladies first, we must also examine how American guards experienced and understood these interactions with German women post. The guards weren't simply mechanical enforcers of policy, they were individual men navigating their own confusion about how to treat women who were simultaneously enemies, prisoners, and ladies according to their cultural programming. Most guards were young men, typically in their late teens or 20s, who had been assigned to POW camp duty because they were deemed unsuitable for combat, perhaps because of minor health issues, age, or training specializations. Many felt conflicted about their assignment, grateful to avoid combat, but also somewhat ashamed not to be serving in more dangerous, prestigious capacities. Guarding prisoners, especially female prisoners, lacked the masculine glory of combat and created its own psychological challenges. These men had been raised in 1940s American culture, with clear expectations about masculine behavior toward women. Their mothers, sisters, Sunday school teachers, and popular culture had taught them that real men protected women, showed them courtesy, and never raised their hands to them under any circumstances. Now they were assigned to guard women who were technically enemies, to maintain discipline and security, to prevent escape or resistance. How could they reconcile the role of armed guard with the role of courteous gentleman? Corporal James Wilson, whose interaction with confused German women at a doorway was documented in a 1945 letter home, later explained his thinking. I didn't see any contradiction. These women were prisoners. Sure, but they were still women. My mama raised me to hold doors for ladies, so that's what I did. Some of the other fellows thought I was going soft, but I figured, we're Americans. We do things different from the Nazis. Treating prisoners with basic decency, that's what makes us the good guys. Not all American guards shared this perspective. Some were hostile toward German posts, seeing them as personally responsible for the deaths of American soldiers, for the Holocaust, for the war itself. These guards maintained maximum psychological distance, performed their duties with cold correctness, and resented any suggestion that they should show courtesy to enemies. The variation in guard behavior reflected broader American attitudes toward German posts, a complex mixture of hostility, curiosity, and surprising sympathy. The dynamics were further complicated by American racial attitudes. The same guards who showed elaborate courtesy to white German women might treat African American civilian staff with less respect, reflecting the pervasive racism of 1940s American society. Some German women post noticed this contradiction. They observed that they, as enemy prisoners, sometimes received better treatment than African American citizens who worked in the camps. This observation created its own kind of confusion, and for some women raised uncomfortable questions about American society's own hypocrisies. Male guards also had to navigate the suspicions and monitoring of female staff members, matrons, and nurses who supervised aspects of the women's daily life, and who were vigilant for any inappropriate fraternization between male guards and female prisoners. The courtesy rituals of ladies first were generally seen as acceptable. They maintained proper distance while showing respect. But guards who became too friendly with prisoners, who seemed to show particular attention to attractive women, or who violated professional boundaries, could face serious consequences. Despite these constraints, relationships did develop, not romantic or sexual relationships typically, but human connections that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. Guards and prisoners would exchange information about their families, their hometowns, their hopes for when the war ended. They would share photographs, practice languages with each other, discover common interests. The ladies' first courtesy ritual often served as an opening, a small acknowledgement of shared humanity that could develop into more substantial recognition across the prisoner-guard divide. The guards also struggled with the cognitive dissonance of guarding women who looked like sisters, girlfriends, and mothers back home. German women POWs were white, European, culturally similar in many ways to American women. Unlike Japanese prisoners who were racialized as fundamentally foreign and threatening, or Italian prisoners who were often seen as comically inferior, German prisoners occupied an ambiguous category where the enemies who had fought skillfully, technologically sophisticated Europeans, but also people who had supported Hitler and Nazi crimes. The women specifically complicated this already complex category, activating protective instincts even toward enemies. As World War II ended in May 1945, the question of what to do with German POWs became urgent. The plan was eventually to repatriate them to occupied Germany, but this process took time. The logistics of transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic, the chaos of immediate post-war Germany, and the need to conduct screening for war criminals meant that many German POWs remained in American camps well into 1946, and some cases even into 1947. For German women POWs, the repatriation process triggered complex emotions. During their captivity, they had adapted to American customs, learned some English, and in many cases developed surprisingly positive feelings toward individual American guards and staff. Some had undergone genuine ideological transformations, beginning to question Nazi ideology and appreciate democratic values. Now they would return to a devastated Germany, to unknown fates, to deal with the consequences of their nation's catastrophic defeat. The preparation for repatriation included practical training and some campus education about conditions in occupied Germany, instruction in how to survive in a collapsed economy, warnings about food shortages and destroyed infrastructure. Some camps provided small packages of supplies to take home. And in many of these final interactions, American guards continued their courtesy rituals, holding doors, saying ladies first, treating the women with dignity even as they prepared to send them back to an uncertain future. For women who had experienced profound transformation during their captivity, the return to Germany was particularly difficult. Hildegard Werner, a former Luftwaffe auxiliary who had spent 18 months in a camp in Oklahoma, later described her return. "I had changed profoundly, but Germany had changed even more. Everything was ruined, physically and morally. I found myself defending American values to other Germans who still clung to Nazi ideology. They called me brainwashed, said I'd become too friendly with the enemy. But I had seen that there were different ways to organize society, different ways to treat people. I couldn't unsee that." The repatriation also meant leaving behind relationships that had developed during captivity. Some women had formed genuine friendships with American female staff matrons, nurses, teachers. These relationships had provided crucial support during difficult times, had facilitated cultural learning and language acquisition, and had demonstrated the possibility of friendship across national boundaries. Saying goodbye to these women was emotionally difficult, and in some cases, correspondence continued for years afterward. The American guards also experienced mixed emotions about the women's departure. Many had come to respect the German women they had guarded, to see them as individuals rather than as abstract enemies. The departure marked the end of a strange chapter, months or years spent in rural American camps guarding foreign women, performing courtesy rituals that had initially seemed absurd in context, but had become routine. Some guards felt relief they could finally be discharged themselves, return to civilian life, put the war behind them. Others felt an unexpected sadness at seeing people they had come to know leaving for an uncertain future. In the decades after the war, memories of these experiences evolved and were reinterpreted in light of changing historical understanding and personal development. German women who had been POWs rarely spoke publicly about their experiences in the immediate post-war years. Being a former prisoner carried stigma in Germany, where attention focused on civilian suffering and German victimization, rather than on the experiences of those who had served in military roles. Many women simply wanted to forget, to rebuild their lives, to move past their association with the Nazi regime. But in the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began conducting oral history projects, and as German society became more willing to confront all aspects of the Nazi period, some former POWs agreed to interviews. Their testimony revealed the lasting impact of their American captivity experiences. Many emphasized the shock of being treated with courtesy, the confusion about ladies first, and the gradual recognition that these weren't tricks or manipulation, but genuine expressions of American values. Some women reflected on how their POW experience had shaped their subsequent lives. Several described becoming advocates for German-American friendship, for democratic values, for gender equality. They credited their exposure to American culture during captivity with opening their eyes to alternatives to the authoritarian, militaristic system they had been raised in. The phrase "ladies first," initially so confusing, had become in memory a symbol of a broader cultural awakening, the recognition that power and courtesy could coexist. That discipline didn't require brutality, that they themselves were worthy of dignity and respect. The story of German women, POWs, being confused by American guards saying "ladies first" might seem like a minor cultural anecdote, a curiosity in the vast history of World War II. But this seemingly trivial encounter actually reveals profound truths about culture, ideology, gender, and the nature of totalitarianism that deserve serious, historical, and philosophical attention. First, the story illustrates how totalitarian systems strip away not just political freedoms, but also the small, everyday courtesies and recognition of individual dignity that make life bearable. Nazi Germany had created a system where people, especially those in military and auxiliary services, were treated as interchangeable units serving collective purposes. Personal dignity, individual preferences, and the expectation of courteous treatment were systematically suppressed as bourgeois weakness. The German women's confusion about ladies first revealed how deeply they had internalized this dehumanization. They literally could uncomprehend the idea that they might be treated with courtesy simply because they were human beings. That authority figures might show them respect without expecting anything in return. Second, the story demonstrates the power of cultural differences to create cognitive dissonance that can, in some cases, open pathways to ideological transformation. The German women weren't converted to American values through propaganda or explicit persuasion. Instead, they were gradually changed through accumulated everyday experiences that contradicted what they had been taught about American society, about appropriate gender relations, about how power works. The American guards who said "ladies first" weren't trying to change German women's ideology. They were just behaving according to their own cultural programming. But the cumulative effect of these behaviors was to demonstrate that different social arrangements were possible, that authority and brutality weren't synonymous, that life could be organized differently. Third, the story reveals the complex relationship between gender oppression and other forms of political oppression. The German women had come from a society that was simultaneously oppressive to women, in many ways limiting their education, careers, and political participation while also mobilizing them for total war. American society was also deeply oppressive to women in systematic ways: employment discrimination, legal subordination, and exclusion from full civic participation. Yet the particular form of American gender ideology, with its emphasis on chivalric courtesy toward women, created possibilities for human dignity that Nazi militarism systematically destroyed. Neither system offered genuine gender equality, but the everyday lived experience of being told "ladies first" versus being treated as an interchangeable cog in a military machine was profoundly different. Fourth, the story illustrates the importance of seemingly trivial courtesies in maintaining human dignity and social connection. Political philosophers and human rights theorists often focus on major rights: freedom of speech, freedom from torture, right to political participation. But the German women's experience suggests that smaller social practices, how people address each other, who holds doors for whom, who goes first in line, also matter profoundly to human dignity and social functioning. A society that systematically strips away these small courtesies, that treats certain categories of people as unworthy of basic respect, has begun the process of dehumanization that can lead to far worse atrocities. Fifth, the story complicates our understanding of American moral standing during and after World War II. It is tempting to use the courtesy shown to German women POWs as evidence of American moral superiority. We treated our enemies better than they treated theirs, proving the superiority of democratic values. But this narrative becomes more complicated when we remember that while white German women were being told "ladies first," African Americans were systematically denied basic dignity and rights. Japanese Americans had been imprisoned in internment camps, and American forces had committed their own war crimes. American courtesy toward German women POWs was real and meaningful, but it coexisted with profound injustices elsewhere. The historical significance of the POW experience for German-American relations also deserves attention. The generally humane treatment of German POWs in the United States, including the controversial courtesies shown to female prisoners, contributed to post-war reconciliation and the development of friendly relations between former enemies. Former POWs returned to Germany with generally positive impressions of American society, becoming informal ambassadors who helped shift German public opinion toward the West during the Cold War. The small courtesies, the ladies' first rituals, accumulated into a broader sense that Americans were decent people worth allying with rather than permanent enemies to be hated. Scholars studying collective memory and historical trauma have also found the POW narratives illuminating. The fact that many German women didn't speak about their experiences for decades, then gradually began sharing them in old age, follows patterns seen in other traumatic experiences. The evolution of their memories from confusion and suspicion during the actual events, to gradual appreciation, to eventual idealization of American courtesy in contrast to Nazi brutality, reveals how personal memories are constantly reconstructed in light of subsequent experience and changing cultural contexts.